Good afternoon. I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of Central European University. And I want to welcome everybody from the wider Budapest community. Our doors are always open, and want to welcome, obviously, faculty, staff, and students from our own community. This is the last talk in the presidential lecture series called Reasons for Hope. I'm not sure whether we've given you reasons for hope or not, but we've certainly tried, God knows. One thing we have done is brought you some extraordinarily fine minds over the last 2 months, and we end with one of the finest. I think it's important to remember that Charles Taylor's associations with Hungary go back to 1956. As a young student, he was part of the World University Service mission of young North American and European students who came to the border between Austria and Hungary to welcome, provide shelter, provide assistance to the thousands and thousands of Hungarians who fled tyranny and fear and Soviet tanks. And that set a pattern for Charles Taylor's involvement in the 20th century that deserves to be noticed. Sometimes when you start in a way in a student, you continue for the rest of your life. And he has had a life of public commitment that is sometimes forgotten in the esteem that he's won as a philosopher. He has stood for public office in my country many times for a political formation other than my own, but a great political formation and part of the national fabric of our country. He has also been a very prominent figure in the debates in Canadian society about what could be called reasonable accommodation. That is, in a multicultural society, what accommodations should majorities make to the creedal beliefs, practices, habits of minorities, and conversely, what accommodations should minorities make to the creedal convictions and secular convictions and public constitutional convictions and institutions of a majority society. And this has been a very fraught issue in Canada, and Charles Taylor led, or was part of, with Gérard Bouchard, the Bouchard-Taylor Commission in Quebec, which published a really internationally important attempt to find a reasoned philosophical way to think through these extremely difficult issues in the relationship between minority and minority cultures, between religious and secular cultures in a modern multicultural society. But you are here in part because so many of you have been influenced by his work as a philosopher. He has produced a famous book on Hegel in 1975, a collection of papers called Philosophy and the Human Sciences in 1985, and a book by which he is known around the world, Sources of the Self, the Making of the Modern Identity. This connects to his work on reasonable accommodation. He's also written a book called Multiculturalism and the Politics of Recognition. He has a long and passionate involvement in the politics and the philosophy of Central and Eastern Europe. It began, I think, with that moment on the Hungarian-Austrian border in 1956, but it's continued with a lifelong association with IWM in Vienna. It goes without saying, as a Canadian, as a fellow patriot, how much it means to me personally to introduce a person I regard with something approaching veneration, if I can say so without embarrassment. Charles Taylor is going to talk to us about democratic degenerations, how democracies degenerate. Let's give a warm CU welcome to Charles Taylor.
Thank you. Very kind introduction. So, yes, thank you, Michael, very much for that very generous introduction. And when I think of the two titles of this talk, one is the series title, Reasons for Hope, and the other is the one I've given, Democratic Degenerations. I wonder whether I shouldn't run out of the room immediately. So I'm going to say some very saddening and depressing things at the beginning, but I think that's still not a misnomer as part of the series, because only if we face these depressing facts and see what possible solutions they allow, do we have a way forward. So I'm going to try in a relatively short time to talk about three directions in which our modern Western democracies have not an inevitability, but a tendency to degenerate, about how these three are working at last together to produce a lot of the phenomena we see here. You might call it xenophobic populism, and then try to look at what this opens for us as possibilities of solutions or pushback or fight back and so on. So let me start with the first one, which is really core to the very meaning of democracy. It's an interesting fact. Well, democracy comes from the Greeks, right? But the kratos, the power of the demos for the Greeks were not the whole people. The demos was the non-elite part of the people, right? That's what, if you translate demos, it doesn't translate, well, it does and it doesn't. And that's the interesting fact, to see that all modern European languages have a word, people, popolo, narod, folk, etc., which has this double meaning. It can sometimes mean the whole population, like the Greek laos, but it sometimes means the, if you like, non-elite part of the population. And what does that reflect? Well, I would argue that it reflects a meaning of democracy, and there are many meanings, so I agree, but it reflects a meaning of democracy as what I want to call a telic concept. A telic concept is a concept which defines the form of life, in this case the form of politics, not by, as it were, particular characteristics that it possesses. There is a concept of democracy like that, the concept you find with Freedom House, where we check off, are there free and fair elections, is there a free press, do people have a right to sleep in their beds unless they do some wrong, etc., and you tick it off and you say, well, those countries are democracies because they make it, and those countries are not, and that's a perfectly good concept. The concept I'm talking about is a telic concept, which I would characterize in the following way. It gives the ideal that this form of government, in this case, is aimed towards, with the understanding that possibly it never fully attains this ideal, and certainly it very often falls short of it, right? So, and what is the ideal? Well, the ideal in this case is that the two meanings of the word people, the whole on one hand, and the non-elites on the other hand, come together in the sense that the second meaning, the demos, the non-elite people, have their weight in the decision roughly proportionate to their numbers, right? That they're not put at a disadvantage and have much less input and much less power than the elites. And this, I would argue, is something that almost certainly never totally happened. But what you notice if you look through history is that there are periods when things are moving that way, moving in the positive direction, and there are periods when things slide away. And the fact that we never fully reach it is almost a necessity of history, because the conditions of the non-elites having this kind of weight in society constantly change. Just think back, in U.S. history, at the time of the founding of the state, the basis of power was land, and then of course democracy became possible because of a lot of public land, unfortunately stolen from Aboriginals. We don't want to go into too much of the seamy side for the moment of that. But then later on in that 19th century, the basis of power was large industrial organizations and complexes. Recently, the basis of power has shifted in another direction to financial institutions and powers and so on. So you have constantly in history a shift in the basis of power, and therefore a shift in the kinds of moves and maneuvers, the kinds of creation of institutions, parties, trade unions, and so on, which are necessary to come close to the democratic ideal. And I think we stand now at a low point in that particular coming and going, rising and falling. We, in the 1945 and in the period after that, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, 45 to 75, we had in Western society move towards a greater equalization. If you want a power, and if you want to see the immediate reflection of this, it was a move towards being less great inequality. The Gini coefficient was it up or down? Anyway, less distance between the very well-off and the less well-off, the highest incomes and the lower incomes. Between 45 and 75, this difference was squeezed. And then from 75, 80 on to today, it's become much, much wider. And in recent time, it's absolutely galloping with the astronomic bonuses and so on that people get in the financial world. That's the index of the inequality of power, but also feeds back as part of the cause of that. Right? So we have this kind of coming and going. Why am I taking this definition of this dynamic definition concerned with the power of the non-elites as my definition of democracy, and not the other one, the Freedom House tick off the criteria, which is perfectly legitimate in its own way? Why do I think this is important? I think this is important because I think that the way many people live democracy is in terms of this understanding. And therefore, in the periods when things are moving ahead, in a sense, towards greater equality, there's a rise in morale, there's a rise in participation, there's a sense that things are moving in the right direction. And in the moments when we're sliding away, you get lower morale, you get, in fact, people turning off, deciding not to participate, deciding not to vote, becoming very cynical, becoming very, dissatisfied. And when there's some kind of hope of an upturn, you get people responding to this. I think maybe the indication of the need for this kind of move towards the telos of democracy, and the sense that not moving that way is felt as a lack, you can see in something like Obama's campaign in 2008, the slogan of which was, "Yes, we can," right? And if you look at the situation of the Indignados in Spain, right, the party that emerged from that is called Podemos, "Yes, we can." Now what does this reflect? It reflects a sense that most of the time, in one of these sloughs and one of these low points in democracy, people feel, no, we can't. We can't do anything. We are powerless to act here, right? And so you can see that the hunger is there. And when something comes along that seems to open an avenue for it, people respond to that. So that's why I would say that for all the validity that the Freedom House, tick off the boxes definition has as an analytic tool, the one I'm talking about, the tailored concept that I'm talking about, is something that people live by to some degree, that actually moves them. If to use a bit of jargon I like using, as part of the social imaginary of a lot of democracies. Now, from that point of view, as I said, we see that things looked very bad, looked already very bad in 2000. They look worse after the 2008. Things are moving downward. And you get, that's one of the great dangers. Now the problem is that this kind of slide away is not self-correcting. That is, it can be self-correcting if there are political movements like the one Obama had, the ones that we see in Spain, the ones that we saw in the American midterms just recently, in which the reaction to the Trump administration and policies and non-policies, and bad policies and good non-existent policies and things like global warming. So the reaction to that was very, very positive. You could see that move back. But prior to that, you get this real sense of grievance, of people for instance, whose conditions they know are just not the same as their parents or the same as they were a number of years ago, that where after 45, and we have to look into all the detail here, but the existence of lifelong jobs in large corporations with benefits, we find that disappearing, and the children of these people can't find permanent employment, let alone, long-term employment, let alone lifetime jobs. They can find small, precarious, part-time work very often. Or another very great slide that's happened in many Western societies is a draining of life and life chances out of the smaller, less central villages and centers to the benefit of the large centers. For instance, in the United States, 10 of the largest cities have grown tremendously, and the result has been taking the life out of the smaller areas, and the sense is very widespread that these are now neglected. Or in the European case, you get the cutting of services, for instance, of transport and other rail and bus services to remote areas, older people who can't move easily, can't get the health that they want, or they can't go and come back the same day, and so on. And you see this kind of complaint even in very successful economies still rather successful economies like Germany, right? So you get this great sense of dissatisfaction. Okay, that's one of the degenerations. I just want to point out that there is a tendency for these generations to feed on themselves unless there is this kind of intervention. See, the less people that vote, right, the more unequal the policies are going to be that are decided, and so the less people vote. Or the less people vote, the more the power of money tells and has real influence, and therefore the less people vote. See, there's a kind of spiral downwards, which is the normal condition. Okay. Well, second degeneration, and here we get to something I think that we have to reflect on, that all democracies need. They need a very strong sense of common reference point. I would call this a political identity. Political identities in Western democracy really have two facets. On one hand, they certainly have a component which is, if you like, ethical, that the society is founded around certain principles, around the principle of democratic rule itself, around principle of human rights, equality, liberté, égalité, fraternité, however it is expressed. These are part of the political identity. But that's never the whole thing, because what you feel strongly attached to is the particular historical project of realizing that ethic, in Quebec, in Canada, in France, in the UK, in Hungary or Austria, et cetera, et cetera. I'll put it in this way, that when I see this political ethic violated anywhere in the world, I'm saddened, I'm sometimes angered. When I see it happening at home, frankly, I feel ashamed. And when I see that sometimes we don't quite go as badly as we could have, I feel proud. That is That is a connection, a very profound connection that one has to one's own particular project. The ethic is the same, and the sense of the ethical disapproval and sadness and so on is the same if the negative movement happens somewhere else when it happens here at home. But there's another kind of link that you have to your particular project. I don't know exactly what Habermas meant by constitutional patriotism, but that is what I would, that's the meaning I would give that term, right? I'm patriotic because to our particular project of realizing this ethic. But now, the problem is that this political identity, which I think is absolutely essential, it's essential because if we are on such a project together, we're called upon to participate in voting, to participate in decisions, to participate in paying taxes, to participate sometimes even in being conscripted and fighting. And we're also called upon to help each other. So we're called upon to engage in various redistributive activities, redistributive functions, whereby we pay taxes and other people who really need it get the benefit of these taxes. And if you have a national health system, that's what's got to be going on. Some people are paying in without needing the medical aid at that moment, and other people are getting more medical aid than they're paying in. This is the natural thing. So, in Canada we have a system of equalization between provinces. We equalize the tax yields and so on, and very often people in the richer provinces say, well, why are we paying taxes for these lazy layabouts there in Quebec? And the answer is, we're Canadians. And see, if people didn't feel that that was an answer, then the whole project, our whole project of realization of democracy would be at risk, would be at the limit impossible. So this powerful sense of political identity is essential. But the trouble is it can turn toxic. I mean, take the ethical dimension of it, right? Well, the idea can come about that certain classes of citizens, they're not living up to this, they're not really into this ethic, I just want to mention a case which is not a case in my country, it's a case in the United States. Romney lost the 2012 election, well, probably for other reasons, but one reason certainly that played against him was that he made a speech somewhere which was not meant to be published, and some nasty person was recording it, where he said, look, 47% of the US population, they're just drawing on the state, they're just taking food stamps or whatever, and the rest are the ones that are really contributing. See, the idea was these are not really fully contributing American citizens. And of course, there are various people on the right in the United States, but also, alas, in Canada, who take that really seriously. I mean, you get attempts by right-wing parties to suppress votes, by which Harper tried, as well in Canada, but which exist in the States. And these people have a good conscience because they're not really stopping people from voting who are really 100% American citizens. So you can get this kind of phony ethicization, phony moralization from the very nature of a certain definition of the political identity, which somehow legitimates discrimination. Or, of course, there's other kinds of reasons for this. For some people, a certain historic part of the community is the Rio community. Very often the States, people talk about the real Americans going right back. Or the community is thought of really ethnically, so only people who belong to that particular ethnic group are really part of it. Or it can be a matter of people who come in later, that people who come in later are not really part of it. What are they doing here? Or, and this is a very subtle and very difficult to deal with, there are conceptions which I call conceptions of precedence. That is, I'm afraid a lot of what people call American racism, but we have it a little bit in Canada too, is that kind of thing. Okay, well, blacks, they belong here, but not quite on the same level, not quite with the same privileges, right? So you get these kind of precedence rules, precedence, or if you like, hierarchical inclusion ideas, right? So there are all these forms, or deformations, if you like, degenerations of the political identity of the country, see? And it's not as though you could say, well, we don't need these political identities, we don't need patriotism. No, we don't. That's not true, we do. You know, you don't run a democracy without this. So you have constantly to fight against its being subtly distorted, subtly turned in one of these ways, which has this exclusionary effect. And the third degeneration is one that you see happening in cases of really powerful fight around different definitions of the national identity. If the national identity begins to grow apart to a very serious degree, you get attempts on the part of people who made a temporary arrival in power, temporarily they got a majority, got a decision and so on, to lock the door behind them and make it impossible for this decision to be reversed. And this is something you see happening in the United States in recent years with the Republicans, with the various systems of gerrymandering, trying to lock the Supreme Court into a certain stance. The idea being to make the particular constellation of decisions now irreversible. Whereas a real democratic community, so I'm appealing to Hannah Arendt here, it's a community of deliberation, of common deliberation, in which you go on deliberating with the same partners or their successors as their children, etc. And different constellations emerge. Majority constellations emerge at different moments, and we still are compatriots, so we still deal with each other, so we still have another discussion in which we can see if another kind of constellation might not arise. They attempt to lock in certain definition of the national identity is an attempt to end that kind of mutual relation, right? To sunder it. Now, unfortunately, you can see how these can move together. That is, generations can, as it were, help each other, fuse with each other. Number one, if you let a situation go on in which a certain part of the population is being less and less advantaged, which is what has happened in Western democracies, very largely under the influence of a kind of rather mindless neoliberal idea that markets do it all if you don't try to interfere with them. If this produces a large part of the population either in these lesser centers or in these various kinds of working class positions which are disappearing, etc., then these people are, these human beings are ready, alas, to hear a certain kind of xenophobic populist appeal. You know, you've been neglected by these elites, and the reason why you're neglected by these elites is they're so concerned about helping these other people outside, and you've got to revolt against this. And of course, this is absolutely tragic on two levels. This deeply divides the population. This, of course, is deeply unjust in regard to the people who are chosen as the enemy here or as the unjust beneficiary. But it also, of course, people who elect this kind of movement, they have absolutely no idea how to actually solve the problems of the people who voted for them. They're not going to make their lives any better, right? But you can see how the neglect by other, if you like, more forces, as it were, more loyal to the ethic of our society, the neglect by them of these people's needs produces an opening. And when you get this kind of opening, you get, of course, a very deep division in the definition of the political identity of the nation, right? Because there are now people saying that this kind of discrimination is part of the righteously conceived political identity, and other people, you know, like myself and Michael and so on, are saying, no, 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 this can't be allowed. And the temptation is there on the part of those who want to make this kind of revision, and as it were, making the circle of real citizens smaller. The temptation is there to lock it in, right? And of course, in an extreme case, they do lock it in, and it does become close to being irreversible. And now I'm touching on something that you know, alas, better than me, more in your experience than mine, alas. Because it could, we have now in the 21st century something we didn't expect to see and we didn't defend against, because we always had in our minds that this return to this kind of discrimination, and well, it's Nazis, you know, it's back to Mussolini, it's back to Hitler. But there's something more insidious is now abroad, where, I mean, it's less terrible. It's not a grab at absolute power. It's not a grab at power which will control every aspect of people's lives. You can leave them alone for a lot of their lives. But it's an attempt to make certain sources of power irreversibly there, right? Of course, perhaps the paradigm of this is Putin's Russia, but, you know, alas, Hungary is, to me, I hope you don't, seems to be in the grip of such a thing. But you can see how all these different degenerations can combine in the way that I'm describing, and that they are now combining in many countries. Okay, so what do you do about it? Well, I mean, I wish I had a complete program. I wish I left it behind. But let me say some of the things that obviously have to be addressed. We need a kind of politics which can give hope to the people who are feeling most disadvantaged. Right? So I think perhaps the best quick summation of this kind of politics would be something that's arisen very hopefully in the U.S. attempts by the Democrats and so on to fight back and take back the House of Representatives, which they did, which is the slogan of a Green New Deal. It's got to be green, because that's the biggest problem ever faced by humanity, and we're just letting it slide out of our control. But it has this, in American terms, the New Deal means that, what did Roosevelt say in the 30s, where the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid was the person that he was trying to talk to, because it's going to address the problems of people whose needs have been neglected, whose situation has been allowed to slide away. And these two goals are not really difficult to combine, because what we're looking for is new sources of employment, new directions of investment in order to give people something to, some source of work. And that's what the attempt to find new sources of energy will inevitably, and is already, leading to. So that's one of the things that obviously, looking at these degenerations, that we need. We need a new kind of program. I'm very worried that in a certain sense, Europe has let, you know, we've all let this slide, but Europe has let this slide, worried more about the dangers of not pursuing a policy of austerity and so on. And the result has been Brexit. I would argue, we can argue this in detail, the result has been these movements that we see rising, and there has to be this kind of program. But that's not all. There's a much more difficult, well, not more difficult, this is terribly difficult already, but there's another very difficult side of this, which is where we need more understanding, more sympathy, more ability to grasp what's going on with others than we usually show in politics. Because people on my side, on our side, all too easily talk about these numbskulls, these deplorables, these uneducated, these yokels, and so on, who are voting for the Trumps and the Le Pen and Salvini and so on. And yeah, there is a really big problem here that political education, understanding what needs to be done, gets much less when you have a long period in which people have been helpless. They lose a sense of what causes what, and that's one very important, very difficult issue. I don't want to go off on that because it'll take me too widely far afield, so that there is a kind of dumbing down. But if you understand why people are attracted to this, what you find is not, in most cases, just monomaniacs who are following this particular kind of bad populism. You find people with very complex identities, right? So, Quebec, for instance, I know this is something that we noticed, that, yeah, a lot of people feel that, well, it's kind of our identity which is being expressed in some of these very phony proposals on laïcité, sort of like our identity is being expressed here. But at the same time, there's a very deep sense that Quebecers have. Nous sommes un peuple solidaire, nous sommes un peuple accueillant, where solidarity, welcoming is a very important part of our identity. And it's not untrue, it's really true. So what you can do, and this is what happened the last time somebody tried this, and the Parti Québécois tried this kind of thing in 2013, they were going to say, a lot of people, you can't take these jobs because you're wearing a hijab or a turban and so on. And somebody said, well, you want to fire them? And suddenly the figures turned around, right? The majority was in favor of this particular legislation, but then when you said you're going to be fired, see? So that shows, this is just an example of how the people that are voting for Trump, for Le Pen, for Salvini, for all these awful people, I'm not talking about Trump, not capable of reaching him. I don't think he has a very complex identity. I think it's kind of narcissism, the whole thing. But maybe you said it's a wonderful thing and you're giving all this money, but it probably wouldn't work. But the average person voting is a very complex person, right? And the same working class American male that may not really think women are equal and may not think that, these strange people from abroad are really that, or may not be so clear on equality of the races. Nevertheless, Michael Sandel makes this very powerful point. They have this sense that as a man, right, I should be able to take care of my family, right? And that's a legitimate goal. So, okay, he may also not be very feminist, but the thing is, you're not making him pass an exam before you allow him to vote for you. You've got to speak to that, and this is where the really difficult part comes in. We have to have a kind of, I would say, almost the ethnographic capacity to understand these people. And there's some wonderful work I can recommend to people here done on the American scene by Arlie Hochschild and by Joan Williams and so on. We have to feed that into the political process and have people who are capable of getting to, not everybody, you'll never get to everybody who's voting for Trump or Le Pen and Salvini, but enough away from them to put an end to them as a threat and to put their weight behind the kind of program that can lead us out of this. So I think if you look at this, what the situation, how the situation came about, if my analysis in terms of these different degenerations is right, then I think it gives us some reason for hope. We can see what to do, perhaps, that will push things that will allow the thrust of politics to move in another direction, in a direction which can actually not only get us out of this, as it were, world in which xenophobic populism is so powerful, but also which can solve some of the really important central problems of our time. So maybe there are reasons for hope. Yeah, there are, after all, reasons for hope. Well, thank you very much for your very kind attention.
Would you like to come down?
Yeah, okay, I will indeed. Here we are. Okay, here we are. Oh, why did I bother doing this?
What we're going to do now, we've got, thanks to your concision, we've got time to have a serious conversation with the audience. And while the audience figures out what question to ask you, and remember what the rules are, question is a short interrogative statement, followed by a question mark, one per customer. Put your hand up and we'll wait for a mic. But while you're getting that, your own thoughts together. I'm deeply sympathetic to what you have to say, so I have to ask a question which is unsympathetic.
Yeah.
The unsympathetic question would be the democratic telos, the purpose of democracy is to live a certain way of life, a democratic way of life. It's not just a set of procedures and pipework of the kind, right? It's a way of life. What do you say to the possibility that people don't want to live the way of life? Mm-hmm. That is to say, the interminable arguments, deliberations, conflicts, the hassle of democracy, the fact that we're always arguing, fighting. Mm-hmm. It's a battle for power, it's a struggle. Some of the longing for strong leadership might actually be hostile to the democratic telos itself. With a consequence, we may be headed towards something irreversible, that is, towards an authoritarianism that at least responds to that. Mm. People actually don't want to live in a democracy. Yeah. I should say, saying that, I don't believe that. But there are people who do believe it, and you feel it sometimes. Mm. Enough of this talk, enough of this argument, enough of this hassle, you know? Yeah. I mean, what do you say? What do you say to that kind of? Because that's a challenge direct to your vision of democracy, not as a set of procedures, not as a set of institutions, but as a way of life.
Yeah. Well, I would just modify slightly. I think that part of what they don't like about it is the arguing, right? Part of what they don't like. So there could be a sense that we're getting nowhere, but there could also be a sense we're getting nowhere in a highly unpleasant, conflictual, mutual insulting way. What really would change that would be the sense of common achievement that people have, the pride they have. I mean, people feel this at the end of the successful war or successful building of, things like in Britain, the National Health Service. They're terribly proud of it now, you see. So that's the problem. It's turning this whole thing around. all these different features of the present situation, division, attempts to shut people out forever, and therefore extremely insulting and mutually conflictual debate, and at the same time, we don't feel we have a say in this, so let's just shut it down. Okay. Mm-hmm. You've got to move people into the other path, and if they are moved into the other path, like the moments of yes, we can, then a quite different picture emerges in which we have done something, right? All those people that followed Obama, wow, we actually did something. We actually put this guy in the White House. It's unthought of. See? And so the only answer to this is a kind of mobilization that can appeal to that other very, very powerful sense of satisfaction. Mm. You're not guaranteed to succeed.
And just to rebut myself, Brexit, one of the interesting things about Brexit is that it's been a nightmare as a process of democratic deliberation. Yeah. But I see no one saying, let's not have more of it. That is, no one's saying what we need here is a strong leader that puts an end to all this nonsense.
yeah.
What they're looking for is a democratic
Yeah,
exit from.
yeah, they could
Okay.
sack, yeah.
Okay, let's get out to questions. I see a question at the far back. I'm going to work forward. Can we get a microphone over there? And then we'll come forward.
Thank you. I have a very simple question. Could claims for historical justice be regarded as degenerations of democracy? Let's take the example of claims for reparations for slavery in US. Could that be regarded as democratic degenerations? Thank you.
Well, I would say not at all, because what you have here is really the aim of reversing a real injustice. I would say that if I were on the US scene, I would say what's important is not to go right back to slavery. What's important is to go back to 1945 plus. Virtually the entire middle class of the 1980s and on made it because they got some kind of housing relatively cheaply in the earlier part, and the value of their houses rose, and therefore their prospects rose, and it was an incredible, I mean, it's the interruption of that which has produced the present state of discontent. Now, the blacks in the United States were more or less frozen out of that. They're frozen out of that even by government programs, right? So I think people could understand if you said, yeah, we won't talk about slavery, just talk about 1945 to today. They were shut out of the escalator that all the white middle class was on. And I think that's not an unreasonable, people can understand that. It's not
But what if
unreasonable.
someone says, but this might be the sense of Julius's question, why 1945? I mean, we got to go back to 1620. We've got to go back to the first slave ship landing.
Yeah.
This is a primal crime, right? And the democratic degeneration problem is that is just, it's too big a problem.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not that it isn't the problem. The democratic problem is that it's too big a problem to fix.
Yeah, well, you don't know what it would mean to fix that, exactly. I mean, and if you to fix it totally, I mean, to have a totally different past in which people is impossible to produce. Whereas what I'm suggesting is something which is, you can really grasp it, the historical process, people have lived through it, easily graspable, and the unjust way in which it was administered is easily evident, and the remedy, is there. I mean, it kind of, so I think in politics you have to put forward things that grasp the imaginations of people and our.
Okay, let's question here.
Thank you. So I will start with the charge. There is a charge made publicly by a couple of people that part of the degenerations that you describe, probably mostly your second type, comes from the political thinking and also politics proper that focuses too much on identity, on the differences, and not so much on the commonalities. So how much merit do you see in that charge, and could you change things, going back to the 80s, 90s?
Yeah, no, because I agree with you entirely. I mean, but just saying, look, guys, you're focusing too much on identity, right, is not going to change it. What could change it is that, yes, you and I are of different stripes in this particular polity, and most of our people are against your kind of people, most of my people, etc. But here we have a project that you and I can be in together, and it really is exciting us as being in together, that is for our common good. And at that point, the difference between us is going to be less important, less weigh on our action and decision than this common project. So I entirely agree with you, but just saying we shouldn't be is, it's not going to change anything. We have to think of a way of getting people out of that.
But when you, just to follow up that good question, that's the claim that we've got into an identity politics because we've lost a common political project, center, left, however you want to describe it. And we've got a very pertinent analysis of democratic degeneration. What's your story about why the common political project is so damn difficult to put together?
Oh, because, I mean, there are really objective reasons why it's difficult to put together. You see, I mean, we didn't have time to go into this, but one of the reasons for people, a lot of workers being in a totally different situation is that the nature of corporations, how they operate internationally, just in time, et cetera, a lot of very complex things have made that situation. But there are programs that have been, bandied around. And nobody is guaranteed that any particular reading of this program is going to succeed. But this is where we should be putting our effort, and some measures of it can. So it's not as though there was an obvious direction. Well, there is in a way. I mean, Green New Deal in general is the obvious thing. But that's really, in a way, part of my message about their democracy never reaching its telos, right? Because the conditions. In the conditions of production in 1945, with Fordist production, et cetera, you could see how that could fit together with the welfare state and so on, and it was a wonderful solution. But that's not going to last forever. And when it ceases to exist, then we have to find something else. And that is the democratic project.
Question in the middle here.
Hi, Professor Taylor. Thank you so much for your talk. My question concerns education. So one of the problems, as I understood from your talk, was that democratic telos is not really shared by society. So how, if you could make any changes to education in Canada, just from your society, what would you change in order to make sure that these telos, this sort of educational thinking, the way we think about democracy, could be given to students across all classes, or not just urban, but rural, sorry. So how would you achieve that? Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of different elements, there's different facets to this. One is the way in which common schooling could bring people together from very different backgrounds. As a matter of fact, what we discover in Quebec is that in Montreal, there are certain schools which have people from immigrant families and, Québécois de souche families, and this really produces very often the result that these kids don't even understand why the grown-ups are arguing about this crazy legislation, right? So that's one facet of it. Another facet is the very good, I think, program we have in Quebec schools on religion and different religious and different ethical outlooks, so that people are not left totally ignorant of other kinds of ways of seeing the world, and therefore are possible victims for all kinds. I mean, the sheer stupidity of the Islamophobic propaganda is something that almost awe-inspiring. I mean, it just has no relation to the history of the world, and so that's another way you could head that off. But thirdly, I think it's the way you teach your history. See, that history can have a legitimate boosting effect. You don't avoid the things that you've done, pretty terrible things, which in our case, a large part of that is our treatment of Aboriginals. But you do bring out moments of common achievement, which people have taken great pride in. And you can see how those particular achievements can be prolonged by further achievements. These kinds of ways the education system can help.
Question here, and then two there. No.
Thank you for the very nice talk. How do you think ethnographic capacity, I love these words you put it, can enable us not only to understand people who may have all sorts of prejudices, Islamophobia, anti-Gypsyism, anti-Semitism, other ingrained in them, and also maybe supported by massive government hate campaigns.
Yeah.
So how can ethnographic capacity can enable us not only to understand the way they see things, but to inspire them to change that view using their political agency?
Yeah. Well, I think that what's important is to recognize that for most people, I mean, there are fanatics who are entirely dominated by some hatred and so on. There are people, I mean, some of the people who commit some of the terrible crimes have real problems of self-shame and hatred, which they hope to solve by this kind of thing, right? But I'm talking about the majority of people who are voting for people spreading Islamophobia. So they have very complex identities. There are all sorts of other facets. They also want to, be able to feed their children. They also want to be able to have some sense of a meaningful future. They also have affinities with this, that, or other. See, it's seeing the complexity, the multifaceted nature of most people's identity, and therefore a way that you can appeal to them, not say to them, abandon Islamophobia, your Islamophobic beliefs. That'd be very nice, but direct assault like that is not going to work. But how, join us in order to achieve something, and then you're going to be working alongside Muslims, and then the process of getting to know begins to thaw these stereotypes if there isn't some very strong psychic reason why you're deeply invested in that particular hatred. See, majority of people are not like that. I mean, the people who do the terrible things, that's one of the problems. One of the problems is that when you have these programs put forward, it encourages people to come up. And, the incidents haineux, we say in Quebec, I mean, hate-filled incidents, which are sometimes just, go back home, it was not chez vous, and so on. But it was very, very wounding for the people concerned, right? So there is a situation which brings out and gives you a sense of satisfaction and of expressing what all your neighbors feel when you do that kind of thing, right? And then there's a context in which you begin to work together with these people, and that seems to you to be foolish. I mean, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And so it's the multifacetedness of, you notice in these kind of really mindless debates between different definitions of the national identity, people throw slogans at each other, throw condemnations at each other. Or you get these, I mean, the American case is one of the most interesting but disturbing. They have something called conservatives and something called liberals. And in the conservative camp, you have people who believe in Jesus, and they believe in guns, and they believe, in not giving people any aid if they're, and how this all fits together, it's very hard to see. But how it all fits together is that people who believe in one of these things have been recruited into the idea of we're threatened and we can only fight back if we get with all the other guys and so on. So you get these two camps, and I mean, that's why there can be no possible discussion and so on, you see. But what could happen to break this up if, somebody said, I believe in God, but I don't like guns. See, if more people did that, or, whatever, with all these, you would get dissolving of these absolutely mindless categories. And it's that we need to work on.
Question there, and then I'll come forward. Yep.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. At the center of most social democratic parties, at least in Europe, is precisely to address at least the first, and in part also, I think, the second source of these degenerations. And yet we are witnessing the literal collapse in most European countries of these parties. So if you were an advisor, what would you tell them and how to change and adjust their party programs?
Well, I mean, that's what this is exactly how I've been thinking of it, because I've worked all my life in the Social Democratic Party, so this is the way I'm thinking of it. This kind of policy is, that I'm trying to elaborate here, should be the basis of the policy. But, you know, there are reasons why social democratic parties will never have the saliency maybe they did in the good old days, battle days, whatever you want to call it, where they were linked to trade unions and youth movements and the kind of big movements behind them. So now, in the present situation in Europe, it's not going to be social democrats alone. It's going to be social democrats and Greens and various other such parties. So they will be part of the movement, but not the whole movement. But the thing is that they've been themselves too much taken up with going along with the really neoliberal inspired belief in the market and so on. That has really meant that they haven't been able to do what should be their job.
Question here.
Thanks. So following on some of these questions, so it sounds like you're really calling for a new social contract and a way to, present hope to people to get back to the Taylorian concept of a more equal democracy. But given both what was just mentioned, the collapse of the center-left in Europe and in the United States, it's really the collapse of a viable conservative party. The Republican Party is no longer acting as a party should. The deep polarization, the antipathy, the us versus them. And what I wonder is, with this deep inequality that you talked about, the corporate backlash, the ability of the super wealthy and the corporate structure, especially combined with the collusion of the right in many countries, makes it very difficult to see how even a proposal like a Green New Deal or a new social contract could flourish without creating this backlash, and that you put on top of that what's already locked in, particularly with media, and you look at this country, you look at other countries, where there's not an alternative source of information for people. It looks overwhelmingly difficult to overcome these obstacles, these more structural obstacles, I guess. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts
No,
about
it is
that.
very, very difficult, and some of the problems I don't have answers for. I mean, the influence of Putin and his trolls is just incredibly powerful. In the last American election and Brexit and so how I don't have, maybe I'm still in the Middle Ages and I don't know enough about this technology. I don't have a real answer to that. I think people are working on it. But we have a secret weapon in the United States. Our side has a secret weapon, which is people who haven't voted and don't usually vote. And that was part of the secret of the November, midterms in the United States last year. You see, if enough people who don't usually vote can be turned out because they really see that where this is going and what's being risked, then there's real hope to turn things around. But of course, the power of money, unfortunately, some, to me, incomprehensible decisions by the US Supreme Court, like on Citizens United, has allowed money to flood totally the system and that is just so bad for democracy. That I agree, we're up against serious.
But that, just on that subject, I would have thought in the litany of democratic degenerations, one of them is that is the degeneration of a certain liberal idea about free speech.
Yeah.
I mean, the Supreme Court judgment on campaign finance said that money is speech.
Yeah, I know. Terrible. Yeah.
And whatever failures can be attributed to the liberal tradition,
Yeah.
one of them was a keen instinct that money is power.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you have to control a political system by controlling the money that flows into it. And if you don't, you lose control of the political system. I mean, so that's one of the, I mean, I guess it's a question then, that may be one of the things you mean by the neoliberal turn. That is that the very concepts of liberal freedom have been distorted and were crucially distorted in that decision, such that
Yeah, no,
you
by-
could provide
yeah.
a legal basis
Yeah.
for the complete inundation of a political system by money.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you entirely on that, but by neoliberal, I mean sort of much too hopeful faith in markets, the working of markets, to achieve some of these redistributions, you see? I think that's what people always felt. Well, you know, in expanding international trade, we're obviously lifting a lot of people out of poverty in other parts of the world. This is very, I don't know if I said this earlier, but that's had tremendously positive effect in the third world, and somehow it'll all work out. And if you have that attitude, you allow these situations to worsen steadily, and that creates the le terreau, the ground in which these movements can grow. That's what I meant by neoliberal. But I agree with you. I mean, there's a standard notion of classical liberalism, which I entirely agree with. The individual has certain rights, and there ought to be freedom of speech, and so on. And this is a distortion of it. That's why I find it incomprehensible. These rights are meant to be rights of actual concrete, bone and blood and flesh human beings. And when they're attributed to these abstract corporations, that is a complete perversion. And I don't know how people trained in the law, I think we're all like that outside the United States. We can't understand how this perversion could have arisen.
Can I follow up those 2 points that were
Yeah.
made about the collapse of the social democratic project, and just ask a question? Because the social democratic project, whatever else it was a belief in the power of the state, the capacity of the state to protect, the capacity of the state to provide public goods, the capacity of the state to regulate the market.
Yeah.
What's the story about why that faith in the state has collapsed? Because just the idea that it was kind of blown apart by something called neoliberalism doesn't seem to me to explain this very well at all.
No. Neoliberalism is a
So-
consequence of something, but
So when
what
you-
exactly is a difficult issue? to
What's
say?
your story about why that faith in the enabling, capacitating, protecting, regulating state that sustained the 30 glorious years
Yeah,
from
yeah.
45, why that began to come apart?
Well, it began to come apart. I mean, I don't know the full list of reasons, and I'd like to be able to put them together. But certainly one of it is that it's very success. I mean, a good example, the UK. So you have these council houses which have lifted a lot of people out of homelessness and so on. And then Margaret Thatcher said, well, we'll sell you the council house, right? Which results in the next generation being incapable of doing that. I sympathize with the people who were given the offer, went for it. I mean, it looked as though the problem had been solved, and so just the very success, and time passes by, so you forget the 30s, and the success doesn't seem that as great as it actually was. That's part of it, right? Then another part of it is that we have this very interesting development in our society of these movements of various groups that were discriminated against, including start off with women, but also gays, but also handicapped, but also et cetera. So you get these movements which as it were, each stands on its own and doesn't seem necessarily to need some kind of coalition. And then there is, of course, the work of people like Hayek and convincing people, and really the Reagan-Thatcher years, where it looked as though, in a context in which it looked as though this was not so important to defend anymore, they blew the whole thing out of the water. I mean, all of this stuff was just, completely bonfire of controls. So you can understand, I think, some of the reasons for what happened.
A question here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a very short question. Among the reasons for hope, because it's our last day today to have some hope, I would like to ask you, because you are a philosopher interested in the social sciences, and what could be the role of the social sciences in the democratic regeneration? I think in the last years we have not been very imaginative, and we need a new sociological imagination, a new critical look at things. And it seems to me that we have been trapped in a form of what I call radicalisme de la chair, as you have spoken some French, armchair radicalism that is totally negative and that misses the point, that is to do the ethnography of people who do not think like us. And this is a very important problem. So what is your view on this?
Oh, I'm entirely in agreement. I think figures like Pierre Rosson-Vallon I find very interesting, because I think his thinking has created some of the conditions. We have to think of it as there is this strange social animal, or Lebensform, which is the modern democratic state. Just how does it actually work? How does it stay healthy? How does it, what Tocqueville did in his day, right, is what we need to do today. And this is an attempt, a very fumbling attempt, because I'm just, one of these philosophers that doesn't understand anything very well, but has dabbled in trying to understand a lot of things. And I entirely agree. It's that project which is tremendously important.
Question? How did we get, let's follow up that question, if I may. How did the modern university get trapped into that kind of empty armchair radicalism? What story would you tell about that? Because that seems to me very pertinent.
Yeah. Well, I think...
And because the follow-on is more devastating still. In some weird way, we lost our curiosity about the very society we're supposed to serve and study. I mean, that would be the knock. I mean, I'm kind of channeling what you said, because I thought it was so...
Yeah.
But what would your story be about how that happened?
Well, one story in the Anglo-Saxon world, what you got was a certain normative theory, very influenced by Kant, but channeled through Rawls and other ways through Habermas and so on, which seemed to think that if we get the normativity right, it'll happen. And that just isn't so. I mean, Tocqueville saw that wasn't so. Anyway, so that these people kind of seem to delegitimate or to relegate the study of the actual form to something quite different, supposedly serious, scientific. I worked in the political science department for years, so we had these fights about comparative politics, and we compared voting patterns and so on, as though this animal could be understood in a very sort of mechanical way. And so these two modes of thought were in completely different universes. They never talked to each other. They were in different departments. It was, if you tried to introduce something from here or there, that's not philosophy. If you try to introduce from there to there, that's not political science. See, so you get this very strange compartmentalization in our academy, which I've never been able to, I certainly never accept, but I've never been able even fully to understand why.
Another question. There.
Tomorrow evening, another world-famous Canadian intellectual will be speaking here in Budapest, Jordan Peterson. And I'm just curious about your views about how he's ended up something of a scapegoat for what are reasonably liberal views, but seem to have been taken up by the right as a sort of a justification for, less liberal views.
Yeah. No, I'm understudied on Jordan Peterson. I haven't got around to making a serious study of that, I have to admit, yeah.
It's to the point of just, are universities really as tolerant as they should be about alternative views?
Well, I don't think, I think you're referring to a problem which exists perhaps more in American universities than in Canadian universities. I think that there isn't so much shutting down of I may be wrong about this, but I don't find in Quebec anyway, I don't find that insistent shutting down of certain views which are about to offend other people and so on. I think this is, but I think to the extent that I have the feeling that making a big thing of this is a little bit of a stalking horse here to beat up on left-wing views in general. But I agree that there are certain events on American campuses which are troubling to me. That's right, but But
The Jordan Peterson issue, as I understand it, though, did start in a Canadian university with he's a Canadian psychologist who objected publicly to the use of gender-neutral pronouns in discussions in a classroom. He wanted people to be called he or her, she or him. And this caused one of these media storms on the back of which a reputation was made. And the claim there is that he has become the avatar, the spokesman for a certain kind of revolt against political correctness on campus. That seems to be the sense of the question. And so then it comes back again, it rather follows the previous question. It's about whether there's something wrong with the way the academy is performing its social function. That seems to me what we're trying to get our...
Well, it's certainly possible to use this in a way which shuts down the exchange of ideas and so on. And there we have to hold out against that. But is it that, well, maybe it's just that I come from a part of the country where that's not,
Doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. There in the middle,
Hi. Thanks so much for all of this, the lecture and everything. So this is kind of a big question, and it's touching upon some previous ones. But often, I've seen several events like this about democratic degeneration, democratic decline, backsliding. These are the terms that are often used in these settings. And it makes it seem like democracy is anti-democratic processes are natural. They're just occurring kind of out of thin air. So this is a big question, but I was hoping you could go back into kind of what is causing these degenerations, this dissatisfaction, this loss of a sense of community, political community identity. From the lens of your initial point about democracy being elite, non-elite struggle, I was hoping you could delve a little bit more into kind of the power shifts that have taken place, or how you see power, how power has shifted, and how well, it's a big question. I was hoping you could delve into that through that lens. What have elites done in order to generate these kind of degenerations? What is happening?
Okay, I think I'm ready to answer that big question. I think I've been trying to answer that big question, because what I'm trying to say with these susceptibilities to degeneration is that they just if you don't do anything about them, they happen of themselves. Now, maybe, for instance, I mean, in part, this is true. So we get back to the thing we were talking about, the example earlier, because of the way in which modern large corporations in capitalism function, right, different from the Fordist in Ford, et cetera, right, and with just-on-time production in many parts of the world, et cetera, et cetera, then certain features of the 30 glorious, of the 30 glorious years, like full-time jobs with benefits and so on, begin to disappear, right? And then you get inequality beginning to grow. So there are, and again, there are various reasons why political identities get redefined because new populations arise and it creates worries in people, et cetera. So it's not that we're totally responsible for this in our absolutely irresponsible and stupid action. It's that we're not prepared for them, for the situations that are created by this, and it takes us a while to figure out what to do. On the other hand, of course, there are forces trying to stop us figuring it out, so there's a struggle going on here. But it's not as though these democratic degenerations are, oh my God, it's all our fault, we are such terrible people who let things slide. It's that new situations create big problems that we have trouble, getting our minds around and and we have to think of the inventivity of all Western societies right through from before the war, the New Deal in the United States, and to some extent in Sweden, and then the creation of different kinds of welfare states in Europe. All this was, political creation, creativity at a very high degree, see? That's what I mean about the generations happen. Now you've got to do something about it. So the faster you get clear on what's happening, the faster you work out a policy, the more you'll get out of it. The faster you'll be out of it. Yeah.
Let's, this is one of these discussions that could go on a good deal longer, but I think we should draw a line here and just, there's lots to say about what Charles Taylor said tonight, and each of us will go out into the night with our own impression of what means most to us. I think it's terribly important in terms of our series of thinking about reasons of hope, is he takes us back to the very meaning of democracy itself. Not simply a set of institutions, not simply a set of procedures, not simply a set of elections, not even a system of rights, but a way of life. An entire way of life that has a very ancient lineage back to the Greeks. And then a very strong sense that that way of life is fragile. It is subjected to growth and change, decay and degeneration. New conditions of capitalism change the conditions under which democracy works. New ideologies put pressure on the democratic settlement. But finally, what I take so strongly from this highly dynamic sense of the democratic way of life is a constant emphasis in Charles Taylor's work on human agency and human responsibility. This is not about vast impersonal forces which we cannot control and cannot understand. This is a story about what we do to ourselves and what we can change ourselves and what we can change in action with others if we care enough about democracy as a way of life. So each of you will draw a different conclusion from what you heard, but that at least is mine, and it gives me at least a very powerful reason for hope and also a very powerful reason to thank Charles Taylor on your behalf.
Thank you.
Can I just say, as always, CEU is a full-service operation. We provide pogach and a glass of wine up the stairs in Natter 13, and Charles Taylor will be there for a minute. So please come by. We welcome you all.